What would you do if a broken lawman hiding from his past saved a wounded native girl from death in the snow only to wake the next morning and find his lonely ranch surrounded by 400 warriors demanding justice, honor, and a choice that could spark war or bring peace? The silence was the first thing you noticed and the last. Out here in the heart of the Colorado Rockies, silence wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence all its own. It was a heavy white blanket, thicker and more suffocating than the endless snows of winter. For 2 years I had wrapped myself in it, seeking a quiet grave for a life that had already died back in Denver. My name is Silas Blackwood, and this ranch, this prison of timber and stone, was my self-imposed sentence. Winter had come early and with a vengeance that year. The wind, a razor-toothed wolf, howled ceaselessly around the eaves of my cabin, piling drifts of snow as high as a man's chest. For weeks, the world had been nothing but a blinding swirl of white. My only companion was a grizzled Mustang named Shadow, whose quiet munching in the barn was often the only sound that broke the monotony. I was 47 years old, but the lines etched on my face told a story of a man far older, a map of trials and failures that had chased me from the civilized world. I had been a U.S. Marshal, once a man who believed in the stark, clean lines of the law. But the law, I learned, was a murky, corrupted thing, and my refusal to bend with it had broken me. They didn't put me in jail. They did something worse. They branded me a liar, stripped me of my badge and my honor, and left me to be eaten alive by the whispers and stares. So I ran not from the law, but from the memory of its failure. That morning the world was frozen still. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a landscape of impossible glittering beauty. The air was so cold it burned the lungs each breath, a cloud of white vapor. I was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe, the only heartbeat in the frozen valley when I first heard it. It was a sound so alien to my world that I froze mid-swing, the axe buried in a block of pine. It was a cry, thin and sharp, snatched and mangled by the wind. It sounded almost human, but I dismissed it. A mountain cat, perhaps. A trick of the wind whistling through the rock formations to the east. Animals died in this cold. It was the way of things. I went back to my work, the familiar ache in my shoulders, a welcome distraction. But the sound came again, clearer this time, a desperate fading thread of sound that snagged on something deep inside me, the part of me I thought I'd buried. The marshal. The man who couldn't ignore a cry for help. Damnation, I muttered the word, a plume of smoke in the frigid air. Leaving the axe where it stood, I trudged to the barn. Shadow snorted a warm greeting, his dark eyes watching me with placid intelligence. Saddling him felt like an act of betrayal against the solitude I had so carefully constructed. Every instinct screamed at me to stay, to bolt the door and feed the fire and let the wilderness claim its own. Helping people had cost me everything. Why in God's name would I start again now? But the cry had been real, and it had been filled with a kind of pain I knew all too well. Riding out the silence, pressed in again, broken only by the crunch of Shadow's hooves in the deep snow. The valley was a pristine bowl of white, ringed by the jagged, snow-draped peaks of the mountains. The sun, a pale disk in a steel-blue sky, offered no warmth, only a harsh, unforgiving light that made the snowfields glitter like a carpet of crushed diamonds. I followed the sound toward the frozen creek that cut through the valley floor. The water was mostly ice, but in the center, a dark, swift channel of black water still flowed, a vein of life in a frozen world. And that's where I saw her. At first she was just a tangle of dark cloth and darker hair snagged on a fallen log at the edge of the icy current. A deer maybe that had broken through the ice. But as I drew closer, a cold dread colder than the wind snaked its way up my spine. It was a person. A woman. She was lying half in the frigid water, a thin crust of ice already forming on her duskin clothes. I slid from Shadow's back and plunged into the snow, my boots sinking to the knee. The cold of the creek was a physical blow, a shock so intense it stole my breath as I waded in. She was young, no more than 20, and Native American. Ute, I guessed from the beadwork on her worn moccasins. Her face, framed by a mess of wet black hair, was delicate, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. But it was pale as milk, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. She was unconscious, her body limp and terrifyingly light as I lifted her from the water's grasp. Then I saw it, protruding from her left shoulder, a dark, ugly thing against the snow white of her tunic, was the broken shaft of an arrow. A fresh wave of cold washed over me, this one having nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't an accident. She hadn't just fallen, she was fleeing. Someone had shot her and left her for dead, and helping her meant inviting whatever she was running from directly to my door. For a long, terrible moment, I stood there, the freezing water seeping into my bones, holding this dying girl in my arms. The old Silas, the broken man who had come here to disappear, whispered in my ear, "Leave her. It's not your fight. It's how you survived." But as I looked down at her face, her eyelids fluttered, a faint, almost inaudible moan escaping her blue lips. In that flicker of life, I didn't see a Ute girl or a problem or a danger. I saw a human being on the brink of death, and the marshal inside me, the man I had tried so hard to kill, roared back to life. The ride back was a frantic, desperate prayer. I wrapped her in my heavy wool coat and held her against my chest, trying to shield her from the wind and share what little warmth my body had. She was a feather in my arms, burning with a fever that was a stark, terrifying contrast to the icy cold of her skin. She drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words in a language I barely understood. Fragments of a story of fire and violence. I pushed Shadow harder than I ever had, his hooves kicking up plumes of snow as we raced against the death that was already closing in on her. My cabin was a single large room built of thick logs I had hewn myself. It was sparse, furnished with a bed, a table, and a few chairs I'd crafted during the long, lonely winter nights. It was my fortress against the world. Now it would have to be her sanctuary. I laid her gently on my bed, the only soft place in the entire house, and began the grim work of saving her life. The arrow had to come out. I'd seen enough wounds in my time to know that leaving it in was a death sentence from infection. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I heated the blade of my hunting knife in the flames of the hearth until it glowed a dull red. I gathered clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, and steeled myself for what was to come. "Hold on, girl," I whispered, though I knew she couldn't hear me. "Just hold on." Removing the arrow was a bloody, horrific business. She screamed once, a raw, piercing sound that seemed to tear at the very logs of the cabin before mercifully passing out. The sight of the barbed arrowhead and the damage it had done turned my stomach. When it finally came free, blood gushed from the wound, a shocking torrent of crimson against her pale skin. For several terrifying heartbeats, I thought I had killed her. I pressed a thick pad of cloth against the wound with all my strength, my mind a frantic litany of curses and pleas to a god I hadn't spoken to in years. Slowly, miraculously, the bleeding subsided. I cleaned the wound as best I could with the whiskey, stitched it closed with a needle and thread I used for mending canvas, and applied a poultice of yarrow I kept for injuries. I wrapped her shoulder in clean bandages, my movements gentle, almost reverent. She was so fragile, a broken bird I had plucked from a frozen stream. The next 3 days were a waking nightmare. The fever took hold of her completely, a raging fire that threatened to consume her from within. I sat in a chair by the bed, sleeping in fits, and starts a constant sentinel against the death that lingered in the corners of the room. I spooned broth and water between her parched lips when she was lucid enough to swallow. I bathed her face with snow-melted water to cool her burning skin. In her delirium, she cried out for her father, her words painting a horrifying picture of an attack of soldiers, of a promise betrayed. In those long, quiet hours, watching the delicate rise and fall of her chest, I felt the walls of my isolation begin to crack. Her fight for life became my fight. Her pain became my own. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the fragile sound of her breathing, a sound that had become the center of my world. I had come to this valley to be alone, to feel nothing. And now this stranger, this girl, from a world so different from my own, was forcing me to feel everything. On the 4th morning, I awoke from a shallow doze in my chair to find her watching me. The fever had broken. Her eyes, the color of rich, dark earth, were clear and intelligent. They held a weariness that went beyond her physical ordeal, but they also held a quiet, steady strength. "You saved me," she said. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, but her English was clear, accented, but precise. A strange heat rose in my cheeks. I did what anyone would have. She shook her head, a small, definite movement. "No," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Not anyone. Not for one of my people." Her words hung in the air between us, a stark reminder of the chasm that separated our worlds. I knew she was right. To most settlers, a wounded Indian was a danger to be eliminated, not a life to be saved. "What's your name?" I asked, changing the subject. "Alara," she said. "It means light." A faint ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Though I have spent much time in darkness lately, I'm Silas. Silas Blackwood. She nodded her eyes, scanning the sparse cabin, taking in the rough-hewn furniture, the stack of books by the hearth, the solitude of it all. You live here alone, Silas Blackwood? The question was direct, and it struck a nerve that was still raw. I do. Are you running from something? She asked, her perception as sharp as a shard of ice. I was taken aback by her frankness, but for some reason I didn't want to lie. I looked at this young woman who had fought so hard for her life, who had seen horrors I could only imagine, and I gave her the truth. Yes, I said, my voice rough. From everything. As the days turned into weeks, the winter held us in its icy grip. The snow piled deeper, cutting off my ranch from the rest of the world entirely. We were two people on a small wooden island in a vast white sea. As Alara's strength returned, she began to move about the cabin, her presence filling the space. In a way I hadn't realized it was empty. A quiet companionship grew between us, forged in the crucible of her recovery and our shared isolation. She told me her story in pieces over bowls of stew by the fire at night. She was the daughter of Kalin, the chief of a band of Ute. They had been traveling to the reservation under the promise of a treaty, a guarantee of safe passage from the army. But a rogue cavalry unit led by a captain who saw all Indians as vermin had ambushed them at dawn. They did not come to talk, she said, her voice low and steady, but her eyes held the fire of a memory that would never cool. They came to kill. They fired on us without warning. Women, children. It did not matter. It was a slaughter. I felt a familiar bitter shame rise in my throat. I had seen that kind of justice before. It was the same rot, the same abuse of power by men with badges and guns that had destroyed my own life. My father, Kalin, fought to give the others a chance to scatter. I was shot as I ran. I fell into the creek. The current carried me away. I do not know who else survived. I may be the only one. Her story resonated with my own in a way that was deeply unsettling. We were both survivors of a different kind of ambush, both victims of a trust that had been betrayed. I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with another soul in years. I told her about Denver, about the corruption I'd uncovered, the powerful men I had tried to expose. I told her about the trial, how they had twisted my words, destroyed my reputation, and turned me into a pariah. She listened with a profound stillness, her dark eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, the silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken understanding. You were a man of the law who tried to uphold it even when it was difficult, she said simply. That is why they saw you as a threat. I failed, I said, the word tasting like ash. The guilty men walked free. I lost everything for nothing. Failure is not the same as dishonor, she countered, her wisdom seeming far beyond her years. You chose to protect your integrity. In my culture, that is a choice of great strength. Her words were a balm on a wound I thought would never heal. For the first time, someone saw not my failure, but the honor in my attempt. In the quiet solitude of that winter-bound cabin, this young Ute woman who had every reason to hate men like me began to mend the parts of my soul that I thought were shattered beyond repair. A strange, comfortable rhythm developed between us. I would do my chores, chopping wood, tending to shadow, and she would mend her clothes or help me prepare meals, her movements becoming stronger each day. Her quiet presence was a comfort, a stark contrast to the howling loneliness I had grown accustomed to. I found myself watching her, admiring the resilience and grace she carried despite all she had endured. I was drawn to her spirit, to the unyielding light within her that even the darkest of tragedies could not extinguish. The silence in the cabin was no longer an oppressive weight. It was a shared peace. A comfortable space where words were not always necessary. One morning, weeks after her arrival, we were sitting at the table sharing a breakfast of coffee and hardtack when we heard it. It was a low, deep thrumming, a vibration I felt more in the soles of my boots than I heard with my ears. It was a sound that did not belong in my valley. It grew steadily, a rhythmic, powerful pulse that vibrated through the frozen earth. Horses. A lot of them. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. Ilara's eyes met mine across the table, wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Hope. I grabbed my rifle from its rack above the door, my old martial instincts kicking in. Stay inside, I ordered, my voice sharper than I intended. I climbed the ladder to the roof of my cabin, my boots slipping on the snow-dusted shingles. I peered out across the valley, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What I saw made the blood drain from my face. A long, dark line of riders was moving across the pristine white of the valley floor. They were spread out in a disciplined formation, not a chaotic mob. Native warriors mounted on powerful ponies that moved effortlessly through the deep snow. Even from a distance, I could see the glint of lances and rifles in the pale morning light. There were hundreds of them. This wasn't a hunting party. This was an army. And they were heading directly for my ranch. I scrambled down from the roof, my mind racing. I was one man with one rifle against a force that could wipe my cabin off the face of the earth without a second thought. Alara was standing at the window, her hand pressed against the cold glass. "They have found me," she whispered. "Who are they?" I demanded, checking the load in my rifle. "My father's warriors," she said, her voice filled with a tremor of awe and relief. "And others. I see the banners of 3 clans. Word of the attack must have spread. The chiefs have gathered for a war council." The full, terrifying implication of the situation crashed down on me. I hadn't just saved a wounded girl. I had given shelter to the daughter of a powerful chief, a catalyst for a potential war. My isolated ranch, my refuge from the world, had just become the epicenter of a conflict that could set the entire territory ablaze. "What will they do to me?" I asked, my voice grim. I was a white man. To them, I was the enemy, no different from the soldiers who had slaughtered their people. Alara turned from the window, her dark eyes searching my face. She was no longer a patient, but a princess of her people, and her expression was grave. "That," she said softly, "depends entirely on what you have done to me." I felt my fate, my very life, resting in the hands of this woman I had known for only a few weeks. The thundering of hooves grew louder, a sound like the coming of the apocalypse, shaking the very foundations of my small, lonely world. I stood by the door, rifle in hand, and waited. The riders fanned out, surrounding the cabin in a silent, menacing crescent. Up close, they were even more formidable. These were not wild savages from some dime novel. They were seasoned, disciplined warriors, their faces grim masks of hardened resolve, their eyes burning with a cold, righteous anger. They sat upon their horses with a quiet stillness that was more unnerving than any war cry. 400 men at least. 400 reasons for me to be dead. One man rode forward from the center of the line. He was older, his long black hair streaked with silver, and tied back in 2 braids decorated with eagle feathers. His face was a testament to a life of hardship and leadership, a landscape of dignified lines and profound sorrow. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to see right through the log walls of my cabin and into my very soul. He radiated an aura of immense authority. This had to be Kalin, her father. He stopped his horse about 30 yards from my door and raised a hand. The entire army of warriors fell silent. The only sound was the snorting of their horses and the whisper of the wind. The chief's gaze fell on me standing in the doorway with my rifle. He looked at me, then at the cabin, his eyes taking in every detail. Then he called out in the Ute tongue. Beside me, Alara took a sharp breath. She stepped out from behind me into the open doorway. The moment her father saw her, his stoic expression cracked. A wave of profound relief and raw emotion washed over his face. Father and daughter stared at each other across the snow-covered ground, a chasm of loss and reunion separating them. He spoke again, his voice choked with emotion. What followed was a rapid, impassioned exchange between them in their own language. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel their weight. I heard my own name mentioned, followed by a torrent of words from Alara. She spoke with a strength and conviction that commanded the attention of every warrior present. She was not just explaining, she was testifying. Finally, Kalin raised his hand for silence. He dismounted and began to walk toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking onto mine. This close, I could see the immense grief he carried, but also an unyielding strength. "You are Silas Blackwood," he said, his English as clear and sharp as his daughter's. It was not a question. "I am," I replied, my knuckles white on the stock of my rifle. "My daughter tells me you pulled her from the frozen creek when she was at the edge of death." I gave a curt nod, not trusting my voice. "She says you cut the soldier's arrow from her shoulder and tended her wound. That you gave her your bed while you slept on the floor. That you shared your food and your fire and asked for nothing." His gaze was intense, searching for any hint of deception. "She also tells me you treated her with honor. That you protected her as if she were your own kin. She needed help," I said, the words feeling inadequate. I gave it. The chief's eyes scanned my face for a long moment. He looked back at the army of warriors, their faces grim and impatient. "Some of my allies," he said, his voice low and grave, "believe that all white men share the guilt for the massacre of our people. They have come here today demanding vengeance. They believe your ranch should be the first to burn. The fear I'd been holding at bay turned my blood to ice. I understood perfectly. Many of those men didn't care about the details. They saw a white man, and they saw a target for their pain and rage. But you don't agree, I asked, my heart hammering. My daughter has told me of your past, Kalin continued, ignoring my question. She says you were also betrayed by your own people for trying to do what was right. That you lost your place in your world because you would not surrender your honor. I was stunned that Alara had shared so much, that she had understood the heart of my story and chosen to use it as a shield for me. What does my past matter to them? I gestured with my head toward the warriors. It matters, Kalin said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, because it offers a solution to a problem you do not yet understand. What problem is that? The army will learn that 400 warriors rode to this valley. They will send soldiers demanding to know why. They will see our gathering as an act of war. How you answer their questions, how this day is explained, will determine whether this winter's snows become red with the blood of our peoples. The weight of his words settled on me. He was right. If I reported this as a hostile encounter, it would be the spark that ignited a full-blown war. If I lied, I'd be an outlaw. I was caught in a trap. What would you have me say? I asked. The truth, Kalin said, but it must be a truth both our peoples can understand. According to our customs, when a man saves the life of an unmarried woman of her standing, he creates a powerful bond, an obligation of honor that must be acknowledged publicly. I frowned, not grasping his meaning, acknowledged how Kalin's gaze flickered to his daughter, then back to me. His next words changed my world forever. What has happened here is a crisis, but it could be an opportunity. A bridge. If a white man of honor and the daughter of a Ute chief were to be joined, it would create a bond that no treaty could ever match. It would give us a reason to be here, a reason the soldiers will understand. The breath caught in my throat. It felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. You're talking about marriage. I am talking about peace, he corrected me, his voice resonating with the weight of his leadership. I am proposing a union that could protect my daughter's honor, save your life, and prevent a war. I looked over at Alara. She stood tall, her expression unreadable but devoid of fear. She was not a pawn in this. She was a willing participant. She met my gaze, and in her eyes I saw not a demand but an offering. A shared path. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. To abandon my solitude, to bind my life not just to this woman but to the fate of her people, to step back into the world in the most dramatic way imaginable. It was insane. It was terrifying. And yet, as I looked at Alara, at the light in her that I had helped save, I felt a stirring of purpose I hadn't felt since I'd pinned on a marshal's badge. This was a chance not just to save myself but to build something meaningful from the ashes of 2 broken lives. A chance to do right not just for one person but for many. I turned back to her father. I thought of the long, empty years stretching out ahead of me in this silent valley. Then I looked at Alara, who had filled that silence with her quiet strength and brought me back to life. The choice was clear. I slowly, deliberately laid my rifle against the cabin wall. I stepped forward and offered my hand to the chief. I would be honored, I said, my voice steady to accept. The ceremony was held right there in the snow-covered clearing in front of my cabin, witnessed by 400 Ute warriors. It was a strange and solemn affair, a mix of Ute traditions and vows spoken in both languages. Kalin officiated, his powerful voice echoing in the vast, silent valley. Alara wore a necklace of polished stones. Her father gave her a splash of color against her simple dawskin dress. I stood beside her, this woman I barely knew, and felt the weight of my past finally being replaced by the weight of a future. When it was done, I was a married man. My wife was a Ute chief's daughter, and my in-laws were an army of warriors who an hour ago might have killed me. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of orange and purple, the warriors prepared to leave. Kalin placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, speaking to her softly in their tongue. Then he turned to me. "She is your wife now," he said, his eyes filled with a father's fierce love. "But she is always my daughter. Her life and her happiness are now your responsibility. Protect her." "With my life," I replied. And I meant it. He nodded once, a gesture of profound trust, then mounted his horse and led his people away, their dark forms eventually disappearing into the twilight, leaving the valley once more to the silence. That night, Alara and I sat by the fire, the same fire that had warmed her back to health. The cabin felt different now, It was no longer just my shelter. It was our home. The silence was not empty, but filled with a new shared reality. "Are you afraid, Silas?" she asked softly, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I considered her question. I thought of the soldiers who would inevitably come asking questions of the settlers who would view our marriage with suspicion and hatred of the immense challenge of building a life between two worlds. "Yes," I admitted, "but for the first time in a long time I'm more afraid of the man I was than the man I might become." "You woke me from a long sleep, Alara." She reached out and placed her hand on mine. Her touch was warm, a small point of light and heat in the vast cold winter. Outside, the wind began to howl again, and the first flakes of a new snow began to fall. But for the first time in years, my cabin did not feel like a refuge from a storm. It felt like the calm at its very center. I was no longer Silas Blackwood, the lonely man in exile. I was a husband. I had a purpose. And as I looked at my wife, I dared to hope that from the depths of a brutal winter, something new and fragile, something like peace, had finally begun to grow. At its heart, this story reminds us that silence and isolation may shield us from pain, but they can also imprison us. Silas believed he was finished, with the world carrying scars of betrayal and failure. Yet one act of compassion pulled him back into life. By choosing to save Alara, he not only preserved another human soul but rediscovered his own. For those of us who have weathered many winters, whether of grief, loneliness, or disappointment, the lesson is clear: healing often begins when we step beyond ourselves and reach toward others. Trust may feel dangerous, and the weight of the past heavy, but extending kindness can open doors to renewal in ways we could never predict. The story also shows that honor is not measured by success or recognition, but by the willingness to act rightly when no one is watching. As we grow older, it becomes easy to believe our purpose has faded. Yet this tale reminds us that meaning can return in an instant through choices rooted in courage and compassion. Even in the harshest seasons of life, there is always a chance to begin again, and to find peace not in solitude but in connection. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.